When my hiking group told me, "You walk too slow for us," I never expected those words would lead me to discover I was worth more than all of them combined. What started as a humiliating rejection on a mountain trail ended with me walking into the most exclusive investment firm in the city, where I learned the truth about the inheritance I'd been sitting on for 15 years. Sometimes the people who push you away are actually pushing you toward your destiny. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Patricia Hartwell, and at 62 years old, I thought I knew exactly who I was and where I belonged in this world. I was the quiet woman who worked part-time at the local library, the one who volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends, the one who lived in the same modest apartment I'd rented 20 years ago. I was also the woman who'd been hiking with the same group of people every Saturday morning for the past 3 years, believing we were friends, believing I belonged somewhere. The Cascade Mountain Hiking Club had been my lifeline after my husband Robert died 5 years ago. Every Saturday at 7 in the morning, we'd meet at various trailheads around our small Oregon town of Pine Ridge. There was Miranda Walsh, a real estate agent who wore designer hiking gear and never missed an opportunity to mention her latest property sale. Chen, a marketing executive who treated our hiking trails like networking opportunities, always on her phone even during the most scenic overlooks. Then there was Stephanie Brooks, a retired teacher who seemed pleasant enough but had a way of making comments that left you questioning yourself for hours afterward. And finally, there was me, Patricia. The woman who apparently walked too slowly for their ambitious pace, though I'd never realized it until that crisp October morning when everything changed. We were tackling Eagle's Peak, a moderate trail that I'd hiked dozens of times over the years. The autumn leaves were at their most brilliant, painting the mountainside in shades of gold and crimson that took my breath away. I'd always been the type to stop and appreciate these moments, to really see what was around me rather than simply rushing through it. Robert used to say that was one of the things he loved most about me, my ability to find wonder in the everyday. But on this particular morning, my tendency to pause and admire a particularly stunning maple tree, or to wait for a shy chipmunk to emerge from the underbrush, was apparently testing my hiking companions' patience in ways I hadn't noticed before. "Patricia, come on," Miranda called from about 50 feet ahead of me on the trail. Her voice carried that tone people use when they're trying to sound patient, but are anything but. "We're trying to make good time today." I quickened my pace slightly, though my arthritic knees protested with each step on the rocky terrain. At my age, pushing too hard on uneven ground was a recipe for injury, something I'd learned the hard way during a solo hike 2 years prior, when I'd twisted my ankle trying to keep up with a group of college students. 20 minutes later, I found myself falling behind again. Not dramatically, perhaps 30 or 40 feet, but enough that the others had stopped at a trail junction to wait for me. I could see them clustered together, their heads bent in conversation that stopped the moment they noticed me approaching. "Sorry," I said as I reached them, slightly out of breath. "I was watching a hawk circling overhead. Did you see it? Absolutely magnificent." The silence that followed was heavy, with something I couldn't quite identify. Miranda exchanged a look with Jessica, who glanced at Stephanie with raised eyebrows. It was the kind of wordless communication that happens between people who've been discussing you in your absence. "Patricia," Stephanie began, her voice taking on that patronizing tone she probably used with her most challenging students. "We need to talk about something." My stomach dropped, though I couldn't have explained why. There's something about those 5 words that never precedes anything good. I adjusted my backpack straps and waited, surrounded by the beauty of the mountain morning and the growing certainty that my Saturday ritual was about to change. "The thing is," Miranda continued, stepping forward as though she'd been elected spokesperson, "we've been talking, and we feel like maybe our hiking styles aren't compatible anymore." I blinked, trying to process what she was saying. "I'm not sure I understand." Jessica jumped in, her voice taking on the same artificially sympathetic tone she probably used when delivering bad news to clients. "You walk too slow for us, Patricia." Every week we end up waiting for you to catch up. It's disrupting the flow of our hikes." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment and something else, something that felt dangerously close to shame. "I didn't realize I was holding you back. I can try to walk faster." "It's not just about the speed," Stephanie said, though her tone suggested she was trying to be kind about delivering a cruel message. "It's about group dynamics. We're all at different fitness levels, and that's okay. But we think you might be happier with a more leisurely group." More leisurely. The euphemism stung more than direct criticism would have. They were essentially calling me old, slow, and incompatible with their vision of what a proper hiking group should be. "We've actually found a group that might be perfect for you," Miranda added, pulling out her phone. "The Golden Years Nature Walkers. They meet Thursday mornings and do much shorter, easier trails. Very relaxed pace." Golden Years Nature Walkers. The name alone made me feel ancient and decrepit. I could picture it perfectly. A group of elderly people shuffling along flat paths, stopping every 10 minutes to rest on benches, discussing their various medical ailments and grandchildren's accomplishments. "I've been hiking these mountains for 15 years, I said quietly, surprised by how steady my voice remained. "Long before any of you moved to Pine Ridge." "We know that," Jessica said quickly, "and we're not saying you can't hike these trails. We're just saying that maybe it would be better for everyone if we hiked separately." Everyone. The word encompassed their tight little circle of 3, efficiently excluding me from their definition of community. I looked around at the familiar faces, people I'd shared countless Saturday mornings with, people I'd considered friends, people who'd apparently been discussing my inadequacies behind my back, measuring my worth by my walking speed and finding me lacking. "Well," I said, adjusting my backpack once more, "I suppose that settles it then. You're not upset, are you?" Stephanie asked, though her tone suggested she hoped I wouldn't make a scene rather than genuinely caring about my feelings. "Of course not," I lied smoothly. "Thank you for being honest with me." The relief on their faces was unmistakable. They'd expected tears, arguments, pleas to reconsider. Instead, I was making it easy for them to dismiss me with their consciences intact. "We'll still see you around town," Miranda said brightly, as though we were simply changing our Saturday grocery shopping schedules rather than ending a 3-year friendship. "I'm sure you will," I replied. As they continued up the trail without me, chatting animatedly among themselves with the kind of energy that suggested they were already feeling lighter, without my slow pace holding them back, I stood alone at the trail junction and tried to process what had just happened. 15 minutes ago, I'd been part of a group, part of something bigger than myself. Now I was a 62-year-old woman standing alone on a mountain trail, officially declared too slow for the people I'd considered my closest friends. The walk back to the parking lot was the longest mile I'd ever traveled. Every step felt heavy, not just because of the downhill grade, but because of the weight of rejection settling on my shoulders. By the time I reached my 20-year-old Honda Civic, the only car left in the small gravel lot, I could hear the echo of their voices from higher up the mountain, probably celebrating their newfound freedom to hike at their preferred pace. I sat in my car for a long moment, keys in my hand, staring up at the trail I'd climbed hundreds of times. The morning sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the parking area, and I realized this was probably the last time I'd see this particular view. The Cascade Mountain Hiking Club had effectively claimed ownership of all our regular trails, and the unspoken rules of small-town social.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Dynamics meant I'd need to find new places to walk if I wanted to avoid awkward encounters. The drive back into town took 20 minutes, winding down the mountain road. I'd traveled so many Saturday mornings full of anticipation for the day ahead. Now the same curves and overlooks felt like a funeral procession for the person I'd been just an hour earlier. Pine Ridge was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, at least by sight, if not by name. Population 8,000. One main street lined with locally owned businesses that had somehow survived the arrival of a Walmart on the outskirts of town 10 years ago. It was the kind of place where your Saturday morning hiking group was legitimate social currency, where being part of something meant you belonged, and being cast out meant you were suddenly invisible. I'd moved here with Robert 22 years ago when he got a job managing the local branch of a regional bank. We'd fallen in love with the town's combination of small-town charm and proximity to outdoor recreation. Robert had been the social one in our marriage, the one who struck up conversations with neighbors and made friends easily. After he died, joining the hiking group had been my attempt to create my own social connections, to prove to myself that I could build relationships without relying on my husband's natural charisma. Now, driving through the familiar streets toward my apartment on Elm Street, I felt the weight of my isolation more acutely than I had since those first months after Robert's death. At least then people had brought casseroles and offered condolences. There were no casseroles for being declared too slow for your hiking group. My apartment was a tidy two-bedroom unit on the second floor of a converted Victorian house. Mrs. Kowalski, my landlady, lived downstairs and had become something of a friend over the years, though she was approaching 80, and our relationship mostly consisted of her sharing vegetables from her garden and me helping her carry groceries upstairs. I climbed the narrow staircase to my door, still wearing my hiking boots and carrying the backpack I'd packed with optimism just 3 hours earlier. Inside, the apartment felt smaller than usual, filled with the kind of silence that amplifies your thoughts until they become overwhelming. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at my kitchen table, looking out the window at the maple tree that had been my companion through 5 years of seasons in this place. It was the same tree I'd photographed dozens of times, documenting its changes from spring buds to summer fullness to the current autumn glory. Robert had always teased me about my obsession with photographing trees, but he'd never made me feel foolish for finding beauty in something so ordinary. The hiking group had never understood that either. They were always pushing forward to the next viewpoint, the next summit, the next achievement. They hiked to conquer while I hiked to commune. Perhaps it was inevitable that we'd become incompatible. But understanding the logic behind their decision didn't make it hurt any less. I spent the rest of Saturday doing mundane tasks, anything to keep my mind occupied. I cleaned the bathroom until it sparkled, organized my already organized closet, and baked a batch of oatmeal cookies that I'd have to eat alone since I no longer had a hiking group to share them with. Sunday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood perfectly. I'd always been an early riser, a habit that served me well during my 30-year career as an elementary school teacher and continued to define my retirement routine. But without the prospect of Saturday hiking to look forward to, the weekend stretched ahead of me like an empty canvas with no idea what to paint on it. I walked to the Pine Ridge Community Library where I worked part-time, even though it was Sunday and the building was closed. Sometimes I came in on weekends to catch up on cataloging new arrivals, or to prepare for the children's story hour I hosted Tuesday afternoons. Today I just needed somewhere to go that felt purposeful. The library was my sanctuary, a beautiful Carnegie building from 1903 that had been lovingly maintained by successive generations of librarians and volunteers. Working there had been Robert's idea, something to keep me engaged during retirement without the pressure of a full-time commitment. "You love books, and you love helping people," he'd said. "It's perfect for you." He'd been right, as he usually was about such things. The library work had given me a sense of purpose and connection to the community, even if most of my interactions were brief and centered around book recommendations or computer assistance. As I unlocked the staff entrance and disabled the alarm system, I reflected on how different this felt from my forced exit from the hiking group. Here, I was valued for my knowledge and experience. Mrs. Henderson, the head librarian, regularly praised my ability to connect reluctant readers with books that sparked their interest. The Tuesday afternoon children were genuinely excited when they saw me, crowding around for story time with an enthusiasm that never failed to warm my heart. But even this refuge couldn't completely shelter me from the implications of Saturday's rejection. Pine Ridge was small enough that news traveled quickly, and I had no doubt that by Monday morning, half the town would know that Patricia Hartwell had been too slow for her hiking group. I spent 2 hours at the library, losing myself in the familiar routine of processing returned books and updating the community bulletin board. When I finally locked up and walked back toward home, The drizzle had stopped and weak Sunday afternoon sunshine was trying to break through the clouds. On impulse, I detoured through downtown Pine Ridge, walking past the bakery where I sometimes bought Robert's favorite cinnamon rolls, past the hardware store where the owners still asked how I was doing whenever I stopped in for light bulbs or shelf brackets, past the small park where summer concerts drew crowds of families with picnic blankets and folding chairs. It was a beautiful town, full of good people living quiet, content lives. But for the first time since moving here, I felt like an outsider looking in, rather than a participant in the community's gentle rhythms. Monday morning brought the dreaded return to routine, except now my routine had a Patricia-shaped hole where Saturday hiking used to be. I went to the library as scheduled, greeting Mrs. Henderson with my usual smile, and settling into the familiar tasks that had once felt fulfilling but now seemed merely adequate. The morning passed quietly until around 10:30, when Miranda Walsh walked through the front doors with a stack of real estate brochures and her practiced professional smile. "Patricia," she called out as though Saturday's conversation had never happened. "How are you doing?" I looked up from the computer where I'd been updating the catalog system, caught off guard by her casual friendliness. "I'm fine, Miranda. How can I help you?" "I was hoping to update our display rack with some new listings. Mrs. Henderson said I should check with you about the community board space." Her tone was perfectly normal, as though we were simply acquaintances conducting routine business rather than former hiking companions who'd parted ways 48 hours earlier. I directed her to the appropriate section of the bulletin board and watched as she methodically replaced outdated listings with glossy new brochures advertising homes I could never afford. Houses with mountain views and gourmet kitchens and 3-car garages, the kind of places where people like Miranda lived and people like me could only admire from the outside. "Thanks so much," she said when she finished, giving me that bright real estate smile that probably helped her close a dozen deals a month. "See you around." And with that casual dismissal, she was gone, leaving me to wonder if I'd imagined the entire hiking group incident. Was this how it would be now? Polite public interactions that pretended our friendship had never existed, while they continued their Saturday adventures without giving me a second thought? The rest of Monday crawled by with agonizing normalcy. I helped a teenage boy find resources for a history report, assisted an elderly man with printing his grandson's wedding photos, and read The Very Hungry Caterpillar to a group of preschoolers who hung on every word with the kind of attention adults rarely gave to anything. Tuesday brought story time, which always lifted my spirits. 15 children between the ages of 3 and 7 gathered on the colorful rug in the children's section, their faces bright with anticipation, as I settled into the reading chair that had been donated in memory of Robert 2 years earlier. "What shall we read today?" I asked, though I'd already selected 3 books that I knew would captivate this particular age group. "Dragons!" shouted Tommy Martinez, a 4-year-old with an impressive vocabulary and an obsession with all things mythical. "Princesses!" countered his sister Maria, 2 years older and firmly convinced that princesses were superior to dragons in every way. "What if we read about a princess who befriends a dragon?" I suggested, pulling out a beautifully illustrated book about cooperation and unlikely friendships. The children settled in with the kind of focused attention that adults spend thousands of dollars on meditation retreats trying to achieve. For 30 minutes, we traveled together to a magical kingdom where differences were celebrated and everyone had a place in the story. As I read, I found myself thinking about belonging and rejection, about the arbitrary ways we decide who fits into our narratives and who gets written out. These children didn't care if I walked slowly or preferred to admire hawks instead of racing to the next viewpoint. They cared that I read with different voices for each character, that I paused at the right moments for suspense, that I treated their questions and observations as valuable contributions to our shared experience. When story time ended and the children scattered back to their caregivers, I felt the familiar pang of returning to a world where acceptance was conditional and friendship could be revoked without warning. Wednesday brought an unexpected visitor to the library. Mrs. Elizabeth Thornton, a woman I recognized but had never formally met, approached the reference desk where I was working. Mrs. Thornton was something of a local legend in Pine Ridge, though the details of her story were fuzzy and often contradictory depending on who was telling it. She was probably in her early 70s, always impeccably dressed, and lived in the largest house on Summit Avenue, a Victorian mansion that had been in her family for generations. Some people said she was wealthy, others claimed she was house-rich but cash-poor, surviving on Social Security in a home too expensive to maintain. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice carrying the kind of refined accent that suggested expensive education and old money. "I'm looking for information about genealogy research. I was told you might be able to help." I set aside the stack of books I'd been processing and gave her my full attention. "I'd be happy to help." "Are you researching your family history?" "Something like that." She glanced around the library as though checking for eavesdroppers. "It's actually quite complicated. I'm trying to track down information about some family connections that may have implications for estate matters." There was something in her tone that suggested this was more than casual curiosity about distant relatives. I pulled out several books on genealogy research and showed her how to access online databases through the library's computer system. "This is very helpful," she said, though she seemed distracted, as if her mind was working on problems I couldn't see. "Tell me, dear, how long have you lived in Pine Ridge?" 22 years, I replied. "My husband and I moved here when he got a job at the bank." "Robert Hartwell, yes, I remember him. A good man." "You must miss him terribly." I was surprised she knew Robert's name, let alone remembered him fondly. In a town of 8,000, it was possible to know of someone without really knowing them, but there was something in her tone that suggested a more personal connection. "I do miss him," I said simply. "Every day." Mrs. Thornton studied my face with an intensity that made me slightly uncomfortable. "You know, dear, I've been thinking about hosting a small dinner party. Just a few interesting people for good conversation and a home-cooked meal. Would you be interested in joining me this Friday evening?" The invitation caught me completely off guard. We'd never had a real conversation before today, and now she was inviting me to dinner at the most impressive house in town. "That's very kind of you," I said carefully, but I wouldn't want to impose. "Nonsense, it would be my pleasure. Sometimes the most interesting connections come from unexpected places." She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "Actually, there's something I'd like to discuss with you, something that might be of mutual interest." There was a mysterious quality to her words that both intrigued and worried me. In my experience, when people said they had something of mutual interest to discuss, it usually meant they wanted something I wasn't sure I was prepared to give. "What kind of something?" I asked. Mrs. Thornton glanced around again, then leaned closer. "It concerns your late husband's family history. There may be some connections you're not aware of. Connections that could be quite significant." My heart skipped a beat. Robert had always been somewhat vague about his family background. He'd grown up in foster care after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12, and had always claimed he had no other living relatives. It had been one of the few topics that could make him uncomfortable, and after the first few years of marriage, I'd stopped asking questions. "What kind of connections?" I asked, though part of me wondered if I really wanted to know. "The kind that are better discussed in private, with adequate time and comfortable surroundings. Please say you'll come Friday evening, 7 o'clock. I promise you, it will be worth your time." I found myself nodding before I'd consciously decided to accept the invitation. There was something compelling about Mrs. Thornton's certainty, as though she knew something about my life that I didn't know myself. "Wonderful," she said, her formal demeanor warming slightly. "I'll see you Friday at 7. Oh, and Patricia? You might want to bring any family documents you have, anything related to Robert's background or family history." She left me standing behind the reference desk with a dozen questions and no answers, staring at the genealogy books she'd abandoned, as though they might provide some clue about what I'd just agreed to. Thursday passed in a haze of speculation and growing nervousness about the dinner invitation. I found myself paying closer attention to Mrs. Thornton's house when I drove past it on my way to and from work, trying to imagine what the interior might look like. What kind of conversation awaited me behind those tall windows and imposing front door? The house itself was a masterpiece of Victorian architecture, 3 stories of intricate woodwork and period details that had been meticulously maintained, despite being well over a century old, The gardens were equally impressive, even in late autumn, with the kind of professional landscaping that required both significant investment and ongoing care. I spent Thursday evening going through the small collection of Robert's papers that I'd kept in a file box since his death. There wasn't much. His birth certificate, our marriage license, a few photos from his childhood in foster care, and some documents related to his military service. Nothing that seemed particularly significant or mysterious. But as I examined each item more carefully than I had in years, I began to notice details I'd previously overlooked. His birth certificate showed he'd been born in Portland, something I'd known, but the hospital name was one I'd never heard him mention. There were gaps in his foster care records, periods where the documentation was missing or incomplete. Robert had always been reluctant to discuss his childhood, saying it was too painful to revisit. I'd respected his privacy and never pushed for details. Now I wondered if there had been more to his silence than simple grief over his parents' death. Friday evening arrived gray and cold, with the kind of October chill that hinted at the long winter ahead. I'd spent an embarrassing amount of time deciding what to wear to dinner at Mrs. Thornton's house, finally settling on a simple black dress and pearl earrings that Robert had given me for our 10th anniversary. The walk to Summit Avenue took 15 minutes from my apartment, long enough for me to second-guess my decision to accept the invitation at least 3 times. By the time I stood in front of Mrs. Thornton's imposing front door, I was genuinely considering turning around and going home. But curiosity won over anxiety, and I rang the doorbell with hands that trembled slightly in the cold evening air. Mrs. Thornton answered the door herself, dressed in an elegant navy suit that probably cost more than I spent on clothing in a year. "Patricia, dear, please come in. I'm so glad you decided to join me." The interior of the house was even more impressive than I'd imagined. Rich, hardwood floors gleamed under the light of what appeared to be original crystal chandeliers, and the walls were lined with paintings that looked like museum pieces. Everything spoke of old money, the kind of wealth that accumulated over generations and expressed itself in quality rather than ostentation. "Your home is beautiful," I said, following her through a hallway lined with family portraits. "Thank you. It's been in the Thornton family since 1887. Sometimes I feel more like a caretaker than an owner, preserving it for future generations." She paused in front of a particularly striking portrait of a distinguished-looking man in military uniform. "This was my great-grandfather, Colonel William Thornton. He built this house after making his fortune in timber and railroad investments." She led me into a dining room that could have been featured in a magazine about historic homes. The table was set for 4, which surprised me since she'd mentioned a small dinner party, but I'd assumed it would be just the 2 of us. "I hope you don't mind, but I've invited 2 other guests," Mrs. Thornton explained, noticing my expression. "I thought you might enjoy meeting them." Before I could ask who else was coming, the doorbell rang, and Mrs. Thornton excused herself to answer it. I heard voices in the hallway, then she returned with 2 men I didn't recognize. The first was tall and silver-haired, probably in his 50s, wearing an expensive suit and carrying a leather briefcase. He had the kind of polished appearance that suggested professional success and financial security. The second man was younger, maybe early 40s, with the informal confidence of someone comfortable in any social situation. He was dressed more casually in slacks and a sweater, but everything about his demeanor suggested intelligence and competence. "Patricia, I'd like you to meet Dr. Marcus Sullivan," Mrs. Thornton said, indicating the older man. "He's a genealogist and historical researcher. And this is David Chen, a financial advisor who specializes in estate planning." I shook hands with both men, my confusion growing by the moment. This wasn't the casual dinner party I'd been expecting, and the presence of professional experts suggested this evening had a specific purpose I didn't understand. "Gentlemen, this is Patricia Hartwell," Mrs. Thornton continued, Robert Hartwell's widow. There was something in the way she said Robert's name that made all 3 of them focus on me with increased attention, as though I'd suddenly become the most important person in the room. "Mrs. Hartwell," Dr. Sullivan said, his voice warm but professional, "I've been looking forward to meeting you. Your husband's family history has some very interesting aspects." "Please, everyone sit down," Mrs. Thornton said, gesturing toward the elegant dining room chairs. "I think we should discuss this properly over dinner." As we settled around the table, I felt increasingly out of place. The china was delicate and obviously expensive. the silverware heavy and beautifully crafted, and the crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier in ways that created tiny rainbows on the white tablecloth. Mrs. Thornton served dinner herself, declining my offer to help with the kind of gracious firmness that suggested she was accustomed to being in charge. The meal was simple but perfectly prepared: roasted chicken with herbs, seasonal vegetables, and fresh bread that filled the dining room with its warm aroma. "Now then," she said once we were all served, "I suppose you're wondering why I've brought everyone together this evening." The thought had crossed my mind, I replied, trying to keep my tone light despite my growing nervousness. Dr. Sullivan cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hartwell, what do you know about your husband's family background?" "Not very much, I'm afraid. His parents died when he was young, and he grew up in foster care. He always said he had no living relatives." The three of them exchanged glances that confirmed my suspicion that this dinner was about more than casual conversation. "That's what we need to discuss," Mrs. Thornton said gently. "It appears that Robert may not have been entirely accurate about his family connections." My fork paused halfway to my mouth. "I'm sorry. What do you mean?" David Chen, the financial advisor, opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Mrs. Hartwell, we have reason to believe that your husband was related to someone who left a substantial inheritance unclaimed for over 15 years. The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke, taking several seconds to fully register. "An inheritance? That's impossible. Robert would have known about any relatives." "Not necessarily," Dr. Sullivan said. "Family connections can be obscured by adoption, name changes, or simply the passage of time. We believe Robert was the nephew of Adelaide Crane, who died intestate in 2008, with assets worth approximately $12.7 million. I set my fork down carefully, afraid I might drop it. $12.7 million? The estate has been held in probate for 15 years, while the court attempted to locate living heirs, Mrs. Thornton explained. Adelaide was something of a recluse, and her family connections were complicated by several generations of adoptions and estrangements. My mind was reeling. But why are you telling me this now? If Robert was her heir, wouldn't someone have contacted us years ago? That's where it gets complicated, David Chen said, pulling documents from his folder. Adelaide's records showed a nephew named Robert Hartwell, but the last known address was in Chicago, and there was some confusion about birth dates and middle names. The estate investigators weren't able to make a definitive connection. However, Dr. Sullivan continued, recent advances in genealogical research, combined with some newly discovered family documents, have allowed us to establish a clear lineage. Robert Eugene Hartwell, born in Portland on March 15, 1954, was definitely Adelaide Crane's heir. I felt dizzy suddenly, as though the elegant dining room was tilting around me. This is impossible. Are you saying Robert inherited over $12 million and never knew about it? We're saying that Robert died before the connection could be established, Mrs. Thornton said gently. But as his widow, you are now the legal heir to Adelaide's estate. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. I stared at the three faces around the table, all watching me with expressions of patient sympathy, waiting for me to process information that seemed too surreal to be true. I don't understand, I said finally. Why are you involved in this? How did you even know about Robert? Mrs. Thornton smiled, and for the first time that evening, her expression held genuine warmth rather than polite courtesy. Because, dear Patricia, Adelaide Crane was my aunt. She was my father's sister, and when she died without a will, I inherited a small portion of her estate, the items that could be directly traced to our family line. But the bulk of her wealth was always meant to go to her nephew Robert. You're related to Robert's aunt? Technically, Adelaide was my aunt and Robert's great-aunt, which made Robert and me second cousins. We never met, which isn't surprising given the family's complicated history, but I've been aware of the connection for several years. David Chen leaned forward. Mrs. Thornton has been working with Dr. Sullivan and my firm to establish the family connections and prepare the legal documentation needed to transfer the estate to its rightful heir. Which is now you, Dr. Sullivan added. Mrs. Hartwell, you are the sole legal heir to Adelaide Crane's estate, which currently has a value of approximately $18.4 million. $18.4 million. The number was so large it didn't seem real, like a figure from a movie rather than something that could actually apply to my life. "This is overwhelming," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "I need some time to process this." "Of course," Mrs. Thornton said immediately. "This is enormous news, and you shouldn't feel pressured to make any decisions tonight. But I did want you to understand the situation and meet the professionals who will be helping you navigate the legal and financial aspects. There will be paperwork," David Chen explained, "and some legal procedures to formally transfer the assets. But Dr. Sullivan's research is thorough, and we don't anticipate any complications." I looked around the table at these three people who had just turned my entire life upside down with information that seemed too incredible to believe. Yesterday I'd been Patricia Hartwell, the slow-walking library assistant who'd been rejected by her hiking group. Tonight I was, apparently, Patricia Hartwell, heir to an $18 million fortune. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," Mrs. Thornton said, "you take some time to absorb this information. When you're ready, Mr. Chen will begin the process of transferring the estate assets to your name. Dr. Sullivan will provide you with copies of all his research so you can understand the family connections. And I'll help you explore your options for managing the inheritance," David Chen added. "This kind of wealth brings responsibilities and opportunities that require careful planning." As the evening wound down and the two men gathered their papers and said their goodbyes, I found myself alone with Mrs. Thornton in her elegant living room, surrounded by the portraits of her ancestors and the weight of information I was still struggling to comprehend. "Why didn't you tell me about this connection sooner?" I asked. "You must have known about Robert for years." Mrs. Thornton settled into a wingback chair that probably predated my birth and considered her answer carefully. "To be honest, I wasn't certain about the connection until recently. Family stories can be unreliable, and I didn't want to raise false hopes. But when Dr. Sullivan's research confirmed the relationship, and when I started paying attention to how you were living, I realized you needed to know the truth." "How I was living?" "Patricia, dear, you're a wonderful woman who's been allowing herself to be treated as less than she's worth. I've watched you for months, seen how people in this town take your kindness for granted, how they dismiss your contributions as though they don't matter. I've thought about the hiking group, about Miranda's casual dismissal and the way they'd made me feel obsolete and unwanted. Tomorrow morning," Mrs. Thornton continued, "you'll wake up as one of the wealthiest women in Oregon. More importantly, you'll wake up with choices you didn't have yesterday. The question is, what are you going to do with that power?" I drove home. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, numbers swirled in my head. $18.4 million. The figure was so enormous it felt abstract, like trying to comprehend the distance to the nearest star. I kept getting up to check the business cards David Chen and Dr. Sullivan had left me, touching them as if they might dissolve and prove the entire evening had been an elaborate dream. By 5 a.m, I gave up on sleep entirely and made coffee, sitting at my kitchen table as dawn broke over Pine Ridge. The familiar view of Mrs. Kowalski's garden looked exactly the same, but somehow everything felt different. I was still Patricia Hartwell, still living in the same modest apartment, still facing the same empty Saturday that stretched ahead without my former hiking group. But now I was Patricia Hartwell, who owned $18 million worth of assets I couldn't even identify. The documents Dr. Sullivan had left with me were thick and detailed, filled with family trees and genealogical charts that traced connections I'd never known existed. According to his research, Adelaide Crane had been an eccentric woman who'd never married, and had devoted her life to collecting art and real estate investments. She'd owned properties in 3 states, a portfolio of stocks and bonds that had grown substantially over the past 15 years, and what appeared to be an impressive collection of 19th-century American paintings. Most intriguing was the photograph Dr. Sullivan had included, a formal portrait of Adelaide taken sometime in the 1980s. She was a handsome woman with silver hair and intelligent eyes, wearing pearls and a qual expression of quiet determination. Looking at her face, I could see hints of Robert in the shape of her nose and the set of her jaw. Family resemblance I'd never had the chance to recognize, because I'd never known she existed. The phone rang at 7:30, startling me from my contemplation of Adelaide's photograph. Mrs. Thornton's refined voice came through the receiver with the kind of energy that suggested she'd been awake for hours. "Good morning, Patricia. I hope you managed to get some sleep after last night's revelations." "Not much," I admitted. "This is all still very difficult to process." "I understand completely. When I first learned about Adelaide's situation, it took me weeks to fully comprehend the implications. That's actually why I'm calling so early. I was wondering if you might be interested in seeing some of Adelaide's properties today. Sometimes seeing tangible assets makes the abstract numbers more real." I looked around my small apartment, thinking about the day I'd planned to spend alone, probably reading or maybe venturing out for a solitary walk, since I no longer had hiking companions. "What kind of properties?" I asked. "Adelaide owned a house here in Pine Ridge, actually. It's been empty since she died, maintained by a property management company as part of the estate. I thought you might like to see it." Adelaide had owned property in Pine Ridge, and I'd never known. For 15 years, there had been a house in my town that belonged to Robert's family, and neither of us had been aware of the connection. "I'd like that very much," I said. "Wonderful. I'll pick you up at 9, if that works for you. And Patricia, you might want to bring a notebook. There will be quite a lot to take in." At exactly 9 o'clock, Mrs. Thornton arrived in a pristine silver Mercedes that probably cost more than I'd earned in the past 3 years. I slid into the leather passenger seat, feeling underdressed in my jeans and sweater compared to her perfectly coordinated outfit. "The house is on Riverside Drive," she explained as we drove through Pine Ridge's quiet Saturday morning streets. "Adelaide bought it in 1994 as an investment property, but she never rented it out. According to the property management records, she visited occasionally, maybe 3 or 4 times a year, but she primarily lived in Portland." Riverside Drive was one of Pine Ridge's most desirable neighborhoods, where established trees lined streets of well-maintained homes with large yards and mountain views. I'd driven through the area many times over the years, admiring the architecture and wondering what it would be like to live somewhere so peaceful and beautiful. Mrs. Thornton pulled into the driveway of a charming craftsman bungalow with a deep front porch and dormered windows. The house was painted sage green with white trim, surrounded by mature landscaping that had been professionally maintained despite years of vacancy. "This is it," she said, producing a set of keys from her purse. 1,800 square feet, 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a detached garage. The property management company has kept it in excellent condition. As we walked up the front path, I tried to reconcile this substantial, beautiful house with my image of Robert's family background. He'd always described himself as coming from nothing, having no family resources or connections. Yet his great-aunt had owned this lovely home just 20 minutes from where we'd lived for over 2 decades. The interior was even more impressive than the exterior suggested. Hardwood floors gleamed throughout, and large windows filled the rooms with natural light. The kitchen had been updated with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, while original built-in cabinets and window seats preserved the home's 1920s charm. "Adelaide had excellent taste," Mrs. Thornton observed as we toured the living room, which featured a stone fireplace and built-in bookshelves. "She updated the important systems but preserved all the period details." I ran my hand along the smooth surface of the mantelpiece, trying to imagine Adelaide spending time in this room, perhaps reading by the fireplace on winter evenings. The house felt warm and welcoming despite being empty, as though it was waiting patiently for someone to bring it back to life. "The master bedroom is upstairs," Mrs. Thornton said, leading me up a staircase with a beautiful wooden banister, along with 2 smaller bedrooms that Adelaide used as a library and art studio. The master bedroom was spacious and bright, with windows that looked out over the backyard garden. Even after 15 years of minimal occupation, I could see evidence of Adelaide's presence in the built-in reading nook by the window, and the careful way the room was arranged to maximize both privacy and natural light. The library was extraordinary. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with what appeared to be a carefully curated collection of literature, art history, and travel guides. A comfortable reading chair sat near the window, with a small table perfectly positioned for a cup of tea and good book. Adelaide was quite well read, Mrs. Thornton said, noting my fascination with the collection. She traveled extensively and had a particular interest in American art and literature. The art studio was equally impressive, with north-facing windows that provided consistent natural light and built-in storage for supplies and canvases. Several easels stood ready for use, and the walls were hung with what appeared to be Adelaide's own watercolor paintings, landscapes and garden scenes executed with considerable skill. She was talented, I said, studying a particularly beautiful painting of mountain wildflowers. Very much so. Many of these will be included in the estate transfer, along with her more valuable art collection, which is currently in storage in Portland. As we completed the tour and returned to the living room, I found myself overwhelmed by the reality of what I was seeing. This wasn't just a house, it was a home that had been loved and cared for, filled with evidence of a life well lived, an interest pursued with passion and intelligence. "Patricia," Mrs. Thornton said gently, "this house is yours now, along with everything in it and all of Adelaide's other properties and assets." I sank into one of the chairs that had been carefully maintained by the property management company, looking around the room that apparently belonged to me. "I don't know what to do with all of this." "You don't have to decide anything today," she assured me. "But I thought you should see it, should understand that this inheritance isn't just numbers in bank accounts. Adelaide built a life, created beautiful spaces, collected meaningful things. Now it's your responsibility to decide what to do with her legacy." We locked up the house and drove back toward downtown Pine Ridge in comfortable silence. I was processing not just the physical reality of owning such a beautiful property, but the emotional complexity of inheriting from someone I'd never known existed. Someone whose life had intersected with Robert's family in ways that might have changed everything if we'd known about the connection. "Mrs. Thornton," I said as we stopped at a traffic light, "why didn't Adelaide ever try to find Robert? If she knew she had a great nephew, why didn't she reach out?" The older woman's expression grew thoughtful. "From what I understand, Adelaide was a very private person, perhaps even reclusive by the end of her life. She'd been hurt by family conflicts earlier in her life, disputes over money and property that left her distrustful of relatives who might be motivated by financial gain rather than genuine affection. But Robert wasn't like that." "No, I don't think he was. But Adelaide had no way of knowing that. She may have preferred to leave her estate to him without creating obligations or expectations during her lifetime. It's possible she thought he'd be better served inheriting from someone he'd never met than having to navigate a relationship with an elderly relative who might have become a burden." It was a sad commentary on how family relationships could become so complicated that love had to be expressed through absence rather than connection. Adelaide and Robert might have enjoyed knowing each other, might have found comfort in their shared interests and values. Instead, she'd remained a stranger, whose generosity could only be discovered after both their deaths. Mrs. Thornton dropped me off at my apartment with promises to call David Chen on Monday morning to begin the formal process of estate transfer. As I climbed the stairs to my second-floor apartment, I felt the weight of knowledge that would fundamentally change my relationship with everything around me. My modest apartment looked shabbier than usual, not because there was anything wrong with it, but because I now had the means to live anywhere I wanted. The furniture I'd accumulated over years of careful budgeting suddenly seemed unnecessary when I could afford to replace everything with items of my choosing. Even Mrs. Kowalski's kind gesture of leaving vegetables from her garden on my doorstep took on different significance when I realized I could now afford to buy anything I wanted at the farmer's market. But the most unsettling realization was how this knowledge changed my perspective on recent events. The hiking group's rejection, which had felt so devastating just a week ago, now seemed almost laughably insignificant. Miranda Walsh, who'd dismissed me as too slow for their ambitious hiking schedule, made her living selling houses that cost a fraction of what I now owned. Jessica Chen, who treated our Saturday mornings like networking opportunities, would probably faint if she knew the quiet librarian she'd rejected was worth more than all of their annual salaries combined. I spent Saturday afternoon researching Adelaide Crane online, trying to learn more about the woman whose legacy I'd inherited. There wasn't much information available, which seemed consistent with her reclusive nature, but I found a few references to her in art auction catalogs and a brief mention in a Portland Newspaper Society pages from the 1970s. The auction catalogs were the most revealing. Over the years, Adelaide had purchased works by several well-known American artists, including a Georgia O'Keeffe painting that had sold for over $2 million in 1995. If that was the caliber of art in her collection, the total value might be substantially higher than even David Chen had estimated. Sunday morning brought an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Kowalski knocked on my door at 8 o'clock, carrying a plate of homemade cookies and wearing the concerned expression she reserved for situations that required her immediate intervention. "Patricia, dear," she said, settling herself on my sofa with the kind of determination that suggested she planned to stay until she got answers. "I saw you leave yesterday morning with Elizabeth Thornton in her fancy car, and I've been wondering what that was about." Mrs. Kowalski had lived in Pine Ridge for over 50 years, and very little happened in our neighborhood without her knowledge. She'd been Robert's favorite among our neighbors, partly because she reminded him of his foster mother, and partly because she had a gift for caring about people without being intrusive. "It was just a social visit," I said, which was technically true even if it vastly understated the significance of the occasion. "Patricia." Her tone was gentle but firm. "I've known you for 5 years, and I've never seen you look the way you looked when you came home yesterday afternoon. Something important happened, and I'm concerned about you." Mrs. Kowalski was 79 years old, sharp as a tack, and possessed of the kind of intuitive wisdom that comes from decades of paying attention to human nature. She'd probably noticed changes in my demeanor that I wasn't even aware of myself. "It's complicated," I said finally. "The best things usually are. Why don't you tell me about it? Maybe I can help you sort through whatever's troubling you." There was something about Mrs. Kowalski's matter-of-fact kindness that made me want to tell her everything. She'd been consistently good to me since Robert's death, checking on me during the worst of my grief, sharing produce from her garden, and treating me like family when my actual family consisted of distant cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. "What would you say if I told you I'd just inherited a significant amount of money from a relative I never knew existed?" Mrs. Kowalski considered this question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'd say that kind of news could be either a blessing or a burden, depending on how you handle it. How significant are we talking about?" "Significant enough to change everything." "And how do you feel about that?" It was such a simple question, but one I hadn't really asked myself. I'd been so focused on the practical implications and the sheer impossibility of the situation that I hadn't examined my emotional response to inheriting Adelaide's estate. "Overwhelmed," I said honestly, "and a little frightened." "What frightens you about it?" I thought about the hiking group's rejection, about how quickly people could dismiss you when they thought you had nothing to offer. Now I had more to offer than any of them could imagine, but the memory of their casual cruelty still stung. "I'm afraid it will change how people see me," I said. "And I'm afraid it will change how I see myself." Mrs. Kowalski nodded, as though this was a perfectly reasonable concern. "Money does change things, there's no denying that. But it doesn't change who you are at your core. You were kind and generous when you had very little, and you'll probably be kind and generous when you have a great deal. But what if I become someone I don't recognize? What if I start thinking I'm better than other people? Or what if people start treating me differently because of what I have rather than who I am?" "Those are good questions to ask yourself," she said. "The fact that you're worried about those things tells me you're likely to handle this responsibly. Bad people don't usually worry about becoming bad people." We talked for another hour, with Mrs. Kowalski offering the kind of practical wisdom that comes from having lived through nearly 8 decades of human experience. By the time she left, taking her empty cookie plate and my gratitude for her listening ear, I felt more grounded and less panicked about the changes ahead. Monday morning arrived with autumn rain and the kind of gray sky that made the library feel especially cozy and welcoming. Mrs. Henderson greeted me with her usual warm smile, and I settled into my familiar routine of processing returned books and updating catalog records. Around 10 o'clock, David Chen called to schedule an appointment to begin the estate transfer process. We arranged to meet at his office Tuesday afternoon, and he mentioned that the initial paperwork would take several hours to complete. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said before ending the call, I want you to know that this process will move at whatever pace feels comfortable to you. There's no rush, and you should feel free to ask questions about anything you don't understand." His professional courtesy was reassuring, but I could hear something else in his tone, a kind of careful respect that suggested he was already treating me differently because of my changed financial circumstances. It was a subtle shift, but noticeable enough to remind me that Mrs. Kowalski had been right about money changing how people perceived you. The morning passed quietly until 11:30, when Miranda Walsh walked through the library's front doors. She approached the reference desk where I was working with her usual professional smile, apparently oblivious to the fact that our last conversation had involved her telling me I was too slow for their hiking group. "Patricia, hi, how are you doing?" Her tone was exactly the same blend of superficial friendliness and underlying dismissal that had characterized our interactions since Saturday's rejection. Looking at her now, knowing what I knew about my changed circumstances, I felt a strange sense of detachment from the pain her words had caused just 5 days earlier. "I'm doing very well, Miranda. How can I help you?" I was actually hoping to update our real estate listings on the community board again. We've had several new properties come on the market this week. She pulled out her usual collection of glossy brochures advertising homes, with asking prices that had once seemed impossibly out of reach. "Of course," I said, directing her to the bulletin board section reserved for local business announcements. As she organized her materials, Miranda made casual conversation about the local real estate market, apparently unaware that she was talking to someone who now owned more property than she'd probably sold in the past year. "The market's been really strong lately," she said, hanging a brochure for a house priced at $750,000. "We're seeing a lot of interest from buyers looking for that luxury mountain lifestyle." I watched her arrange her advertisements, thinking about Adelaide's house on Riverside Drive with its craftsman details and mature landscaping. According to the property management records Mrs. Thornton had shown me, similar houses in that neighborhood had been selling for well over $1 million, which meant I owned property worth more than Miranda's most expensive listing. "That's wonderful," I replied, maintaining the same polite interest I'd always shown in her real estate updates. "You know, Patricia, I've been thinking about our conversation on Saturday," she said, her voice taking on the kind of tone people use when they want to revisit an uncomfortable topic without actually apologizing for it. "Oh? I hope you weren't too disappointed about the hiking group situation. I really do think you'll be happier with a more relaxed group that matches your pace better." There was something almost patronizing about the way she phrased this, as though she was doing me a favor by excluding me from activities I might find too challenging. A week ago, this would have hurt. Today, it struck me as simply irrelevant. "I'm sure you're right," I said mildly. "Have you had a chance to look into that Golden Years group I mentioned? I think they meet at the community center." Golden Years. The name still rankled, with its implication that I belonged with people who'd accepted their limitations and settled for gentle activities appropriate to their diminished capacities. "Actually, I've been exploring other options," I said. "Oh? What kind of options?" For a moment, I was tempted to tell her exactly what kind of options were available to someone with Adelaide's inheritance. I imagined her expression if I mentioned that I could afford to hire a private hiking guide, or join any exclusive outdoor club in the region, or even buy my own mountain property where I could hike at whatever pace I preferred. Instead, I simply said, "I'm considering some new activities that might be a better fit for my interests." Miranda finished organizing her brochures and gave me the same bright smile she probably used with clients who weren't quite ready to buy but might become prospects with proper cultivation. "Well, I'm sure you'll find something perfect. See you around town." After she left, I sat at the reference desk thinking about the strange double life I was apparently going to be living for the foreseeable future. Most people in Pine Ridge would continue to see me as the quiet librarian who'd been too slow for her hiking group, while I privately navigated the reality of being one of the wealthiest residents in town. The rest of Monday passed without incident, but I found myself paying closer attention to the small details of my routine that would probably change once the estate transfer was complete. The careful way I checked prices at the grocery store, mentally calculating whether I could afford the more expensive coffee or organic vegetables. The automatic anxiety I felt when my car made a strange noise, knowing that major repairs would strain my limited budget. The resignation I'd learned to feel when invited to restaurants or events that cost more than I could comfortably spend. All of these ingrained habits of financial caution would soon become unnecessary, replaced by the kind of freedom that comes with having more money than you could reasonably spend in several lifetimes. Tuesday morning brought crisp autumn air and clear skies, the kind of weather that would have made for perfect hiking conditions. I found myself thinking about the Cascade Mountain Hiking Club as I drove to work, wondering if they were enjoying their newfound freedom to hike at their preferred pace without my apparently burdensome presence slowing them down. The irony wasn't lost on me that their rejection had indirectly led to my invitation to Mrs. Thornton's dinner party, which had resulted in learning about an inheritance that made their casual dismissal seem almost comically insignificant. If they hadn't told me I was too slow for their group, I might never have met the people who could tell me I was worth more than I'd ever imagined. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, I arrived at David Chen's office for my appointment to begin the estate transfer process. His firm occupied the top floor of Pine Ridge's most prestigious office building, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the surrounding mountains. David greeted me personally, which seemed unusual for someone I'd assumed would be accustomed to wealthy clients. He escorted me to a conference room where Dr. Sullivan was waiting with what appeared to be several boxes worth of documentation. "Mrs. Hartwell," Dr. Sullivan began, "before we start the legal paperwork, I wanted to review the genealogical research with you in detail, so you understand exactly how the family connections were established." For the next hour, he walked me through charts and documents that traced Adelaide's lineage back several generations, showing how her brother had died young, leaving behind a son who was adopted and whose name was changed from Crane to Hartwell. That son had eventually become Robert's father, creating the family connection that neither Robert nor Adelaide had been aware of during their lifetimes. The research was complicated by the adoption records and name changes, Dr. Sullivan explained, but DNA evidence from Adelaide's estate, combined with historical documentation, makes the connection definitive. There's no question that Robert was her great-nephew and legal heir. David Chen then began explaining the legal process of transferring the estate assets to my name. Adelaide's inheritance included not just the house in Pine Ridge and her art collection, but properties in Portland and San Francisco, a diversified investment portfolio, and several bank accounts that had been accumulating interest for 15 years. The total current value of the estate is approximately $21.8 million, he said, presenting me with a detailed asset summary that was several pages long. $21.8 million. The number had grown even larger than the initial estimates, apparently because several of Adelaide's investments had performed exceptionally well during the years the estate had been in probate. "What does this mean in practical terms?" I asked, staring at figures that still seemed too abstract to comprehend. "It means you're a very wealthy woman," David said with a slight smile. "Once the transfer is complete, you'll have assets that generate substantial income even if you never touch the principal. Conservative investment management would provide you with several $100,000 per year in passive income." Several $100,000 per year. I thought about my current income from the library, which barely covered my basic living expenses, and tried to imagine having more money than I could reasonably spend. "The immediate question," David continued, "is how you'd like to structure the asset management. We can maintain Adelaide's existing investment arrangements, which have been quite successful, or we can work together to develop a new strategy based on your preferences and goals." "I don't even know what my preferences and goals should be," I admitted. "This is all completely new to me." "That's perfectly understandable. Most people in your situation take several months to adjust to their new financial circumstances and develop a clear sense of how they want to proceed." We spent another 2 hours reviewing documents and signing preliminary paperwork to begin the transfer process. By the time I left David Chen's office, my head was spinning with information about trusts and tax implications and investment strategies that I'd never needed to understand before. As I drove home through Pine Ridge's familiar streets, I found myself looking at everything with new eyes. The modest houses that had always seemed adequate now appeared small and cramped. The local businesses I'd patronized out of financial necessity now seemed like choices I could make based on quality and preference, rather than budget constraints. But perhaps most significantly, I found myself thinking about the people who'd dismissed me as unimportant or inadequate. People like Miranda and the hiking group who judged my worth based on superficial characteristics like walking speed or economic status. Tomorrow, I decided, it was time to start exploring what it meant to be Patricia Hartwell with $18 million worth of options. Wednesday morning dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for outdoor activities. As I got ready for work, I found myself thinking about hiking again, not with longing for the group that had rejected me, but with curiosity about what hiking experiences might be available to someone with unlimited financial resources. On impulse, I called in sick to the library. It was the first time I'd used a personal day for anything other than genuine illness or emergency. But I felt a sudden need to explore my changed circumstances more actively than my usual routine allowed. Instead of driving to work, I drove to the local outdoor equipment store, a place I'd always browsed but rarely purchased from because of the high prices. Today, I walked through the aisles with a different perspective, looking at gear based on quality and performance rather than cost. "Can I help you find anything?" asked a young salesperson who'd probably seen me browsing their clearance sections many times over the years. "I'm looking for high-quality hiking equipment," I said. "Money isn't a concern." His expression shifted slightly, the way people's faces change when they realize you might be a more serious customer than they initially assumed. "What kind of hiking are you planning to do?" he asked, leading me toward their premium equipment section. "I'm not sure yet. Everything, maybe. Day hikes, overnight trips, possibly some guided adventures." For the next hour, I equipped myself with gear that I'd admired from a distance for years. A lightweight backpack that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Hiking boots that felt like they'd been custom-made for my feet. Layers of technical clothing designed for serious mountain conditions. As the salesperson tallied up my purchases, the total approached $2,000, more than I'd ever spent on recreational equipment in my entire life. But watching him process my credit card without any of the anxiety I usually felt about large purchases was oddly liberating. "These are excellent choices," he said as he packed everything into bags. "You're going to love this gear. Are you planning any specific trips?" "I'm still deciding," I said, which was true enough. My next stop was the travel agency on Main Street, a small business I'd walked past hundreds of times but never entered because I couldn't afford the kind of trips they specialized in organizing. The agent, a middle-aged woman named Carol, who'd lived in Pine Ridge for decades, looked up from her computer with the polite interest of someone accustomed to helping residents plan modest vacations within reasonable budgets. "I'm interested in adventure travel," I told her. "Hiking and outdoor experiences, probably international destinations. What kind of budget are we working with?" she asked, pulling out brochures for various outdoor adventure companies. "Budget isn't a constraint," I said, enjoying the way her expression changed as she reassessed the kind of client I might be. "Well, in that case, let me show you some really special options," Carol said, her enthusiasm becoming genuine rather than professional. "There are some incredible guided hiking programs in places like Patagonia, the Himalayas, and the Swiss Alps." She spread out materials for adventure travel companies that specialized in small group, luxury outdoor experiences. The prices were substantial, several $1,000s for week-long trips. But the destinations and itineraries were everything I'd dreamed about during years of browsing travel magazines I couldn't afford to act on. "This company does amazing work in Nepal," Carol said, pointing to photos of trekkers in spectacular mountain scenery. "They provide experienced guides, high-quality equipment, and small group sizes. Very exclusive." "What about timing?" I asked. "How soon could I book something?" "For the premium programs, you usually need to book several months in advance, but let me make some calls. Sometimes they have last-minute openings, especially for single travelers who can be flexible about dates." I left the travel agency with a folder full of information about adventures I'd never imagined being able to afford, feeling simultaneously excited and overwhelmed by the possibilities that were suddenly available to me. My final stop was the most impulsive decision of the day. I drove to the Mercedes dealership in the neighboring town of Millbrook, 20 minutes from Pine Ridge, where I'd sometimes gone to browse cars I couldn't afford to buy. The salesperson who greeted me was professionally polite, but clearly skeptical about my likelihood of making a purchase, especially after noting my 20-year-old Honda in the parking lot. "I'm interested in looking at your vehicles," I said. "Something reliable and comfortable. Probably a sedan or small SUV." He showed me through their inventory with the kind of routine enthusiasm that suggested he was going through the motions rather than expecting a sale. But when I asked specific questions about features and performance, and when I mentioned that I was prepared to pay cash, his demeanor shifted noticeably. "Let me show you something that might be perfect," he said, leading me toward a silver sedan that looked both elegant and practical. "This is our E-Class model, very popular with customers who want luxury combined with reliability." I test drove the car, marveling at how smoothly it handled compared to my aging Honda. The interior was beautiful, with leather seats and technology features that seemed almost futuristic compared to what I was accustomed to. "What would be involved in purchasing this today?" I asked when we returned to the dealership. "Today?" His surprise was evident. "Well, we'd need to handle the financing paperwork, arrange for insurance, that sort of thing." "Are you trading in your current vehicle?" Quote, "No financing necessary, I'll pay cash." And yes, I'll trade in the Honda. The transaction took 2 hours, during which the salesperson's attitude toward me underwent a complete transformation. By the time I drove off the lot in my new Mercedes, he was treating me with the kind of deference usually reserved for the dealership's most valued customers. As I drove home to Pine Ridge in a car that cost more than I'd earned in the past 2 years, I reflected on how dramatically my day had changed from my usual routine. This morning I'd been Patricia Hartwell, the quiet librarian who couldn't afford new hiking boots. This evening I was Patricia Hartwell, the woman who'd spent more money in one day than she usually spent in 6 months. But the most interesting part wasn't the purchases themselves. It was observing how differently people treated me when they perceived me as someone with money to spend. The outdoor equipment salesperson had become genuinely helpful, rather than merely polite. The travel agent had opened up a world of possibilities I'd never been shown before. The car salesperson had gone from skeptical to deferential in the space of a single conversation. None of these people knew about Adelaide's inheritance, but they'd all responded to subtle cues about my ability and willingness to spend money. It was my first real lesson in how wealth changed not just what you could do, but how people perceived and treated you. As I pulled into the parking space behind my modest apartment building, I caught sight of Mrs. Kowalski watering her garden. She looked up at the unfamiliar car with obvious curiosity, then did a double-take when she recognized me getting out of the driver's seat. "Patricia?" she called. "Is that your car?" "It is now," I replied, still adjusting to the reality myself. "My goodness, that's quite a change from your Honda." "Yes, it is." Mrs. Kowalski studied my face with the kind of attention that suggested she was trying to understand more than just my automotive upgrade. "Everything all right, dear? You look a bit overwhelmed." "I'm fine," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. "Just adjusting to some changes. Big changes, from the looks of it. You know I'm here if you need someone to talk to." Her offer was genuine and comforting, a reminder that some relationships were based on something deeper than financial circumstances. Mrs. Kowalski had been kind to me when I had very little, and she was still kind to me now that I apparently had a great deal. That evening, I sat in my apartment surrounded by shopping bags full of expensive gear and travel brochures for adventures I could now afford, trying to process the reality of my transformed circumstances. In one day, I'd spent more money than I usually spent in months, and I'd barely made a dent in the inheritance that would soon be officially mine. But more than the material changes, I was grappling with the psychological shift from scarcity to abundance, from limitation to possibility. For over 5 years since Robert's death, I'd defined myself by what I couldn't afford, what I couldn't do, what was beyond my reach. Now I was being forced to reimagine myself as someone with unlimited options, and the adjustment was more challenging than I'd expected. As I prepared for bed, I thought about Miranda Walsh and Jessica Chen and Stephanie Brooks, probably planning their next Saturday hiking adventure without giving me a second thought. They'd dismissed me as too slow for their group, not knowing that I could now afford to hire the best hiking guides in the world, travel to the most spectacular trails on any continent, or even buy my own mountain if I wanted a private place to walk at whatever pace suited me. The thought should have been satisfying, but instead, it left me feeling strangely empty. Wealth, I was discovering, was more complicated than simply having access to things you'd previously couldn't afford. It was also about navigating relationships and self-perception in ways I hadn't anticipated. Tomorrow, I decided I would call David Chen to ask about accelerating the estate transfer process. It was time to stop living between my old life and my new circumstances. It was time to fully embrace being Patricia Hartwell, inheritor of Adelaide Crane's fortune, and to discover what that identity actually meant. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp November air that made every breath feel sharp and invigorating. I'd barely slept, spending most of the night thinking about the phone call I intended to make to David Chen about expediting the estate transfer process. But first, I had something else I needed to do. I called Mrs. Henderson at the library and submitted my resignation, effective immediately. After 22 years of teaching and 5 years of part-time library work, I was finally in a position where I didn't need to work for financial reasons. The conversation was brief and professional, though I could hear the surprise in Mrs. Henderson's voice when I declined to give a specific reason for leaving. My next call was to David Chen, who seemed pleased to hear from me so soon after our Tuesday meeting. "Mrs. Hartwell, I was hoping you'd call. I've been in touch with the probate court, and we can actually expedite the transfer process significantly if you're prepared to proceed quickly." "How quickly?" "We could have everything finalized within 2 weeks if you can come in tomorrow afternoon to complete the remaining paperwork. There are some decisions you'll need to make about asset management and account structures, but nothing too complicated." 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, I would officially be one of the wealthiest women in Oregon, with access to resources I was still struggling to comprehend fully. "I'll be there," I said. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and made a list of everything I wanted to accomplish before officially becoming Adelaide's heir. It was a short list, really just one item. I wanted to confront the people who had dismissed me as too slow for their hiking group, not out of petty revenge, though I'd be lying if I said there wasn't some satisfaction in imagining their reactions, but because I'd realized that their rejection had been a gift, even if they'd never intended it that way. By telling me I wasn't good enough for their group, they'd inadvertently set in motion the chain of events that led to Mrs. Thornton's dinner invitation and the discovery of my inheritance. I spent Thursday afternoon researching the Cascade Mountain Hiking Club schedule, which they posted on a community website along with photos from their recent adventures. They were meeting Saturday morning at Eagles Peak, the same trail where they'd delivered their verdict about my walking speed 2 weeks earlier. Perfect. Friday afternoon's meeting with David Chen was surprisingly straightforward. We finalized the paperwork that would transfer all of Adelaide's assets to my name, established accounts with his firm to manage the investment portfolio, and discussed strategies for the tax implications of inheriting such a substantial estate. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said as we concluded our business, "I want to congratulate you on handling this transition so thoughtfully. Many people in your situation make impulsive decisions they later regret. You've shown remarkable restraint and good judgment." His comment reminded me of my shopping spree on Wednesday, when I'd spent thousands of dollars on hiking gear and a new car without feeling any of my usual anxiety about money. But David was right about restraint. I could have easily spent 10 times that amount without affecting the inheritance significantly. "I'm still adjusting to the reality of it all," I admitted. "That's completely normal. Most of our clients take several months to fully absorb the implications of significant wealth. The important thing is that you're taking time to make considered decisions rather than rushing into major life changes." Little did he know that I was planning exactly that kind of major life change, starting with a confrontation that was probably going to surprise everyone involved. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of brilliant mountain light that made every peak stand out in sharp relief against the deep blue sky. I dressed carefully in my new hiking gear, each piece representing equipment that was superior to anything I'd owned before. The boots alone had cost more than my entire previous hiking outfit combined, but they felt incredible, supportive and comfortable in ways that made me understand why serious hikers invested in quality equipment. I loaded my new backpack with supplies for a day hike, though I wasn't sure how long I'd actually be on the trail. The plan was simple. Arrive at Eagles Peak around the same time as the Cascade Mountain Hiking Club, intercept them at some point during their hike, and have the conversation I'd been imagining for 2 weeks. The drive to the trailhead took 30 minutes in my new Mercedes, which handled the winding mountain roads with a smoothness that made my old Honda seem primitive by comparison. As I pulled into the familiar gravel parking lot, I spotted the vehicles I recognized from previous Saturday mornings: Miranda's white Lexus SUV, Jessica's red Audi, and Stephanie's practical Subaru Outback. They were probably already on the trail, which meant I'd need to hike at a faster pace than usual to catch up with them. Fortunately, my new gear made that entirely possible. The lightweight pack and superior boots transformed hiking from the laborious effort it had become in recent years to something that felt almost effortless. I set off up the familiar trail at a brisk pace, energized by the crisp morning air and the anticipation of the encounter ahead. The autumn foliage had reached its peak, painting the mountainside in brilliant shades of gold and crimson that took my breath away. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't thinking about walking speed or group dynamics or whether I belonged anywhere. I was simply enjoying the physical challenge and natural beauty that had drawn me to hiking in the first place. 20 minutes up the trail, I caught sight of 3 familiar figures ahead of me at the first scenic overlook. They were taking a break, probably admiring the view and congratulating themselves on their efficient pace without any slow hikers holding them back. I approached them deliberately, my footsteps quiet on the trail until I was close enough to speak. "Good morning, ladies." The 3 of them turned simultaneously, their expressions cycling through surprise, confusion, and something that looked like mild annoyance at having their perfect hiking morning interrupted by the woman they'd recently dismissed from their group. "Patricia," Miranda said, her voice carefully neutral. "What are you doing here?" "Hiking," I replied simply. "Same as you." "But we thought—" Jessica began, then stopped herself as though realizing that finishing the sentence might sound rude. "You thought I'd found that Golden Years walking group you recommended?" I smiled, noting how uncomfortable they all looked. "Actually, I've been exploring other options." Stephanie stepped forward with the kind of patronizing concern she'd probably perfected during her teaching career. "Patricia, I hope you're not pushing yourself too hard. This trail can be quite challenging." "I'm managing just fine, thank you." And I was. Despite hiking at a pace that would have winded me 2 weeks earlier, I felt strong and energetic. The new gear made such a difference that I was beginning to understand why serious hikers were willing to invest in quality equipment. "Well," Miranda said, clearly wanting to end this awkward encounter, "we should probably get moving. We're trying to make good time today." "Of course you are," I said. "Mind if I join you? I promise to keep up." The 3 of them exchanged glances that communicated their reluctance more clearly than words could have. But they were trapped by the basic social courtesy that makes it difficult to explicitly exclude someone from a public trail. "I suppose that would be fine," Stephanie said with obvious reluctance. For the next hour, I hiked with my former friends at a pace that would have been impossible for me just 2 weeks earlier. My new boots gripped the rocky terrain with confidence, my lightweight pack felt almost weightless, and my improved fitness from daily walks around Adelaide's property in my new gear meant I wasn't struggling to keep up. In fact, I was beginning to suspect I could set a faster pace than they were comfortable with, if I chose to. The conversation during our hike was stilted and awkward, filled with the kind of polite observations about weather and trail conditions that people make when they're avoiding discussing the obvious tension in the group. But I was patient. The conversation I really wanted to have would come later, when we reached our destination. Eagles Peak offered one of the most spectacular views in the region, a 360-degree panorama of mountain ranges that stretched to the horizon. It was here, 2 weeks earlier, that they'd informed me I was too slow for their hiking group. It seemed appropriate to return to the same location for what I expected to be our final conversation. We reached the summit just before noon, and the view was even more breathtaking than I remembered. Clear skies allowed us to see peaks that were usually hidden by haze, and the autumn colors of the valley below created a tapestry that belonged in a museum. "Beautiful day for a hike," I said as we settled onto the rocky outcrop that served as an informal resting area. "It really is," Miranda agreed, though her tone suggested she was still puzzled by my presence and unexpected ability to keep pace with them. "I'm glad I could join you," I continued. "I wasn't sure I'd have another opportunity to hike with the Cascade Mountain Hiking Club." Jessica looked up from the energy bar she'd been unwrapping. "What do you mean?" "Well, I'll be traveling quite a bit in the coming months. International destinations mostly, Nepal, Patagonia, the Swiss Alps. Places I've always wanted to hike but never had the opportunity to visit." The silence that followed my statement was pregnant with questions they were too polite to ask directly. How could a part-time librarian afford international adventure travel? When had I developed interests in destinations that required significant financial resources? That sounds expensive, Stephanie said carefully. It is. I agreed. But I've recently come into some resources that make it possible. Miranda's real estate instincts kicked in immediately. Resources? An inheritance. From a family member I never knew existed. It turns out my late husband had relatives who were more successful than either of us ever realized. I watched their faces as they processed this information, seeing the exact moment when their perception of me began to shift from the woman who'd been too slow for their hiking group to someone who apparently had access to financial resources they'd never suspected. How much of an inheritance? Jessica asked, her marketing background making her comfortable with direct questions about money. Substantial, I said, enjoying their obvious curiosity. Enough to fund whatever lifestyle I choose, including travel to some of the world's most exclusive hiking destinations. The dynamic between us was changing rapidly. Where they'd been politely tolerating my presence, they were now paying attention with the kind of focused interest that people show when they realize they may have misjudged someone's importance. That's wonderful news, Miranda said, her voice taking on the warmth she usually reserved for potential clients. You must be thrilled. I am. Though it's been an adjustment. Learning to think differently about what's possible. I imagine it would be, Stephanie said, her patronizing tone replaced by something that sounded like genuine interest. What kind of changes are you planning to make? This was the opening I'd been waiting for. I stood up and walked to the edge of the rocky overlook, gazing out at the spectacular mountain vista before turning back to face the three women who'd dismissed me just 2 weeks earlier. The first change I made was leaving my job at the library. When you don't need to work for financial reasons, it changes your perspective on how you want to spend your time. You quit your job? Jessica sounded impressed despite herself. I did. Yesterday, actually. I also bought some new gear. I gestured to my obviously expensive hiking outfit, and started researching adventure travel companies that specialize in luxury outdoor experiences. I had their complete attention now. They were studying my equipment with new eyes, noting details they'd missed earlier, probably calculating the cost of my boots and backpack and technical clothing. But the most interesting change, I continued, has been discovering how differently people treat you when they perceive you as having money. What do you mean? Miranda asked, though her slightly defensive tone suggested she suspected where this conversation was heading. Well, for example, the salesperson at the outdoor equipment store yesterday. The same person who'd watched me browse their clearance section for years suddenly became extremely helpful when I mentioned that money wasn't a concern. I paused, letting them absorb the implication that I'd been shopping in clearance sections while they'd assumed I simply preferred less expensive gear. And the travel agent who showed me completely different options once she realized I could afford their premium adventure packages. The same woman who'd never mentioned those programs during previous conversations because she assumed they were beyond my budget. The three of them were beginning to look uncomfortable, as though they suspected this conversation wasn't as casual as it had initially seemed. People make assumptions, I continued, based on limited information. They see a woman who works part-time at the library, who lives in a modest apartment, who shops carefully and drives an older car, and they make judgments about her worth, her capabilities, her place in their social hierarchy. Patricia, Stephanie began, her voice taking on the careful tone people use when they sense criticism coming. For instance, I said, cutting her off gently but firmly, they might assume that such a woman is too slow for their hiking group, that she can't keep up with their ambitious pace, that she'd be better off with a more leisurely group of people her own age. The silence that followed was heavy with recognition. They knew exactly what I was referring to, and they knew that I was about to hold them accountable for their casual dismissal of my worth, based on assumptions that had proved entirely incorrect. They might even suggest she join something called the Golden Years Nature Walkers, I continued, because surely a woman of her circumstances couldn't handle real hiking with serious people who have important places to be. Miranda's face was flushed with embarrassment. Patricia, We didn't mean anything personal by that conversation. We were just trying to find a solution that would work better for everyone. Were you? Because what I heard was 3 women telling me I wasn't good enough for your group, that my presence was disrupting your hiking experience, that I should find people more suited to my limitations. That's not what we intended, Jessica said quickly. Perhaps not, but that's what happened. You judged me based on superficial observations and decided I didn't belong in your group. You made assumptions about my financial situation, my physical capabilities, and my social status, and you acted on those assumptions without knowing anything about the reality of my circumstances. I walked back toward them, noting how they'd all grown very still, as though movement might escalate a confrontation they were beginning to realize they couldn't win. The irony, I said, settling back onto the rocky outcrop where we'd had our original conversation, is that your rejection was actually a gift. If you hadn't told me I was too slow for your hiking group, I might never have had the series of conversations that led to discovering my inheritance. We're glad it worked out well for you, Stephanie said carefully. Are you? Because I'm curious about something. Now that you know I can afford to travel anywhere in the world, hire the best guides, buy the finest equipment, would you still say I'm too slow for the Cascade Mountain Hiking Club? The question hung in the mountain air like a challenge none of them wanted to accept. They couldn't very well maintain that I was too slow when I'd just hiked to Eagle's Peak at their pace without showing any signs of fatigue. They couldn't claim I lacked proper equipment when I was wearing gear that was superior to anything they owned. And they couldn't argue that I didn't belong in their social circle when I'd just revealed resources that probably exceeded all of their household incomes combined. Patricia, Miranda began her real estate training helping her navigate difficult conversations. I think there may have been some miscommunication in our previous discussion. We never intended to suggest that you weren't welcome in our group. Didn't you? Because I have a very clear memory of being told that my walking pace was disrupting the flow of your hikes, that group dynamics weren't working, that I'd be happier with people who matched my fitness level better. We may have expressed ourselves poorly, Jessica admitted. Or, I suggested, you may have expressed yourselves exactly as you intended, based on assumptions that turned out to be completely wrong. I stood up again, shouldering my expensive backpack with movements that demonstrated none of the physical limitations they'd assumed characterized my hiking ability. The thing is, ladies, I no longer need your hiking group. I have access to outdoor experiences that make our Saturday morning walks around Pine Ridge seem like gentle strolls in the park. I can hike with professional guides in locations you've probably only seen in magazines. I can afford equipment and training and travel opportunities that will challenge me in ways our local trails never could. I started walking toward the trail that would take us back down the mountain, then turned back for my final observation. But I wanted you to understand that your judgment of me was based on incomplete information and unconscious bias. You saw a quiet woman with limited apparent resources and decided she wasn't worth including in your activities. You were wrong about my resources, wrong about my capabilities, and wrong about my value as a hiking companion. Patricia, wait, Stephanie called as I began to walk away. Maybe we could talk about you rejoining the group. We obviously misjudged the situation. I paused on the trail, considering her offer. A week ago, being invited back into their group would have felt like vindication. Now it felt like exactly what it was. A transparent attempt to associate themselves with someone they suddenly perceived as worth knowing. That's very kind, I said, but I'll be in Nepal next month starting a 3-week trek in the Himalayas with a guide who's summited Everest 6 times. The month after that, I'll be in Patagonia exploring glacial regions most people will never have the opportunity to see. I'm afraid I won't be available for Saturday morning hikes around Pine Ridge. I left them sitting on Eagle's Peak, probably trying to process how dramatically their understanding of Patricia Hartwell had changed in the space of a single conversation. As I hiked back down the mountain at a pace that would have impressed them if they'd been able to observe it, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge, and everything to do with self-respect. They'd dismissed me as too slow for their group, based on assumptions about my worth and capabilities. Today, I'd shown them exactly how wrong those assumptions had been, not by asking for their acceptance, but by demonstrating that their acceptance was no longer necessary or relevant. The drive home from Eagle's Peak gave me time to reflect on how much had changed since that first humiliating conversation 2 weeks earlier. I was no longer the woman who'd driven away from that parking lot feeling rejected and invisible. I was no longer someone whose self-worth depended on acceptance from people who'd never bothered to understand who I actually was. When I reached Pine Ridge, instead of going directly home, I drove to Adelaide's house on Riverside Drive. I'd been visiting the property daily since discovering my inheritance, partly to familiarize myself with what I now owned, but mostly because the house felt like a connection to the family member I'd never had the chance to know. Today, walking through the rooms that would soon officially belong to me, I thought about Adelaide's life and the choices that had led to her reclusiveness. She'd been hurt by family conflicts, had learned to distrust people who might be motivated by her wealth rather than genuine affection. In response, she'd withdrawn from relationships, choosing solitude over the risk of being valued for the wrong reasons. I understood her caution now in ways I wouldn't have 2 weeks earlier. Wealth changed how people perceived you, how they treated you, what they assumed about your motivations and character. The hiking group's sudden interest in renewing our friendship was just the beginning. Soon, I'd probably discover that I had more friends in Pine Ridge than I'd ever realized. People who'd somehow overlooked my existence when I was just the quiet librarian, but would find me fascinating now that I was the quiet millionaire. The challenge would be distinguishing between relationships based on genuine connection and those motivated by financial interest. Mrs. Kowalski's consistent kindness provided a baseline for comparison. She'd been good to me when I had very little, which suggested her affection was based on something deeper than my bank account balance. But most other relationships would need to be reassessed in light of my changed circumstances. The hiking group had already revealed their true character by rejecting me when they thought I had nothing to offer, then trying to reconnect when they learned about my inheritance. Their behavior provided a template for recognizing similar patterns in future interactions. As I locked up Adelaide's house and prepared to drive home, I realized that my confrontation with the hiking group had served its purpose. I'd needed to demonstrate, both to them and to myself, that I was no longer the woman who could be casually dismissed as inadequate. I'd needed to prove that their judgment of me had been based on incomplete information and prejudiced assumptions. But more importantly, I'd needed to establish that their acceptance was no longer something I required for self-worth. I'd found my value in something more substantial than the approval of people who'd never bothered to know me well enough to understand what I could contribute to their group. The following Monday brought the official completion of the estate transfer process. I sat in David Chen's conference room as he presented me with documents that formally transferred all of Adelaide's assets to my name. Bank accounts, investment portfolios, real estate holdings, art collections. Everything that had taken Adelaide decades to accumulate was now legally mine. "Congratulations, Mrs. Hartwell," David said as I signed the final papers. "You are now officially one of the wealthiest residents of Oregon." The number on the final accounting statement was even larger than previous estimates. $23.2 million, not including several pieces of artwork that were still being appraised by specialists. "What happens now?" I asked, staring at figures that still seemed too abstract to represent anything real. "Now you decide what kind of life you want to live," David replied. "You have complete freedom to pursue whatever interests you. Support whatever causes matter to you. Live wherever and however you choose." Complete freedom. The phrase was both exhilarating and terrifying. For most of my adult life, my choices had been constrained by financial limitations. Work schedules, budget considerations, and practical necessities had shaped every major decision. Now, for the first time since my early 20s, I could make choices based purely on preference and personal fulfillment. That afternoon, I called Carol at the travel agency to confirm my booking for the Nepal trek. 3 weeks in the Himalayas with an experienced guide and a small group of serious hikers, staying in mountain lodges that provided comfortable accommodations in some of the world's most spectacular wilderness areas. "Mrs. Hartwell," Carol said, her voice bright with excitement, "I have wonderful news. The outfitter called this morning, and they've had a cancellation for next month's departure. If you're flexible about dates, you could be in Kathmandu in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. The timeline was aggressive, but I found myself saying yes without hesitation. Why wait? I had no job to arrange vacation time around, No financial constraints to consider. No obligations that couldn't be postponed or delegated. My next call was to Mrs. Kowalski, who deserved to know about my upcoming absence and the longer-term changes in my circumstances. "Nepal?" she said when I explained my travel plans. "My goodness, Patricia, that's quite an adventure. Are you sure you're prepared for that kind of trip?" "I think so. I've been hiking regularly, I have excellent gear now, and the guide service has an outstanding reputation for safety." "Well, if anyone can handle it, you can. You're stronger than most people realize." Her confidence in my capabilities was touching, especially coming so soon after the hiking group's assumption that I was too fragile for challenging outdoor activities. "Mrs. Kowalski, there's something else I need to tell you, about the inheritance I mentioned last week. I wondered when you'd be ready to discuss that. I've been watching you drive that fancy new car and wearing expensive clothes, putting together pieces of a puzzle you weren't quite ready to share." I told her everything. Adelaide's connection to Robert, the genealogical research that had established our family relationship, the magnitude of the estate I'd inherited. Mrs. Kowalski listened with the kind of focused attention that suggested she understood the complexity of my situation better than I'd expected. $23 million, she repeated when I finished explaining. "Patricia, dear, that's more money than most people can comprehend. I'm still trying to comprehend it myself. How are you feeling about it all?" The question was simple, but the answer was complicated. Grateful, certainly. Adelaide's generosity has given me opportunities I never could have imagined, but also overwhelmed, and maybe a little scared. Scared of what? Of changing into someone I don't recognize. Of losing relationships that matter because people start treating me differently. Of making poor decisions because I don't understand what it means to have this kind of wealth. Mrs. Kowalski nodded as though these were entirely reasonable concerns. "Those are good things to worry about, Patricia. Bad people don't usually worry about becoming bad people." She'd used almost the same words she'd offered the previous week, but they resonated even more strongly now that the inheritance was official, and the changes in my life were accelerating. "The important thing," she continued, "is to remember who you were before you learned about the money. You were kind, generous, thoughtful, and hardworking when you had very little. Those characteristics don't disappear just because you now have a great deal." Her words were reassuring, but I knew the real test would come in the months and years ahead, as I learned to navigate relationships and decisions in the context of unprecedented financial freedom. The weeks leading up to my departure for Nepal passed in a blur of preparation and adjustment. I moved out of my apartment and into Adelaide's house on Riverside Drive, partly because it was more comfortable and spacious, but mostly because living in her former home felt like honoring her memory and the family connection I'd never had the chance to explore during her lifetime. The house suited me in ways I hadn't expected. Adelaide's library became my daily retreat, her art studio inspired me to try watercolor painting for the first time since high school, and her garden provided peaceful space for reflection during the overwhelming process of adjusting to wealth. But the most significant change wasn't material. It was the gradual shift in how I saw myself and my place in the world. I was no longer Patricia Hartwell, the quiet woman who worked part-time at the library and lived carefully within modest means. I was Patricia Hartwell, heir to Adelaide Crane's fortune, with resources and opportunities that came with both privilege and responsibility. The hiking group never contacted me again after our confrontation at Eagles Peak, though I occasionally heard updates through the small-town network that made privacy nearly impossible in Pine Ridge. Miranda had apparently mentioned to several people that I'd come into some money and was planning international travel. Jessica had been seen driving past Adelaide's house, probably trying to assess the value of my new living situation. Stephanie had asked Mrs. Henderson at the library about the circumstances of my sudden resignation. Their continued interest in my changed circumstances confirmed that my assessment of their character had been accurate. They were curious about my wealth, but not curious enough to apologize for their dismissal or attempt genuine reconciliation. They wanted to know about my money, but they didn't want to know about me. 2 days before my departure for Nepal, I received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Thornton arrived at Adelaide's house carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing the kind of smile that suggested she had something important to celebrate. "Patricia, dear, I hope you don't mind my dropping by unannounced. I wanted to see you before your trip and share some news that I think will interest you. She settled into Adelaide's living room with the kind of comfort that suggested familiarity with the space. I spent many evenings here with Adelaide over the years. She would have loved knowing that the house went to someone who appreciates it the way you obviously do. It's a beautiful home. I'm still discovering things she collected, books she read, places she traveled. I feel like I'm getting to know her through her possessions. That's exactly what she would have hoped for. Adelaide always believed that houses should reflect the people who live in them, that objects should tell stories about the lives they've witnessed. Mrs. Thornton opened the champagne with practiced ease and poured 2 glasses of what was probably very expensive wine. "The news I wanted to share," she said, handing me a glass, "concerns the art appraisal David Chen mentioned. The specialists have completed their assessment of Adelaide's collection, and the results are quite remarkable." I waited while she consulted a folder she'd brought with her. "The total appraised value is just over $47 million. I nearly dropped my champagne glass. $47 million? Adelaide had extraordinary taste and excellent timing in her purchases. Several pieces have appreciated dramatically since she acquired them, particularly her American Impressionist paintings and her collection of early Georgia O'Keeffe works. $47 million in art, in addition to the $23 million in other assets. I was apparently worth over $70 million, a figure so large it seemed to exist in an entirely different category from normal human experience. This means," Mrs. Thornton continued, "that you're now one of the wealthiest women in the Pacific Northwest, with resources that carry both tremendous opportunity and significant responsibility." "What kind of responsibility?" "The responsibility that comes with having the power to make a real difference in the world." Adelaide supported several charitable causes during her lifetime, but quietly, without seeking recognition. She believed that wealth should be used to improve conditions for people who'd had fewer advantages and opportunities. She pulled out another folder, this one containing information about the organizations Adelaide had supported: literacy programs, scholarships for first-generation college students, environmental conservation efforts, and animal welfare initiatives. She left detailed notes about her philanthropic interests, suggestions for how her wealth might continue to serve these causes after her death. "Of course, you're under no obligation to continue her charitable activities, but I thought you should know about her values and priorities." As Mrs. Thornton explained Adelaide's approach to philanthropy, I realized that my inheritance came with more than financial assets. It came with a legacy of using wealth to create positive change, a model for how someone with substantial resources might contribute to making the world better, rather than simply accumulating possessions. "I'll need time to study this," I said, overwhelmed by the idea that I now had the resources to fund scholarships, support conservation efforts, or address social problems in ways that could make measurable differences in people's lives. "Of course, there's no rush. But I wanted you to understand that Adelaide saw wealth as a tool for service rather than just personal comfort. She lived modestly and gave generously, finding fulfillment in knowing her resources were helping others achieve goals they couldn't have accomplished alone." After Mrs. Thornton left, I sat in Adelaide's living room surrounded by art worth more than most people would earn in several lifetimes, trying to absorb the reality that I now had the power to change lives, fund dreams, and address problems on a scale I'd never imagined possible. The hiking group's rejection, which had seemed so devastating just a month earlier, now appeared as a minor incident in a much larger story about discovering not just wealth, but purpose. Their judgment of my worth had been based on superficial observations and prejudiced assumptions, but more importantly, it had been irrelevant to my actual value and potential. I was Patricia Hartwell, heir to Adelaide Crane's fortune and legacy. I could walk as slowly as I wanted on any trail in the world, and I could also use my resources to ensure that other people had access to outdoor experiences, educational opportunities, and financial security that might otherwise be beyond their reach. My plane to Nepal departed on a Thursday morning in December. As I settled into my first-class seat for the long flight to Kathmandu, I thought about the journey that had brought me from rejection by a local hiking group to a Himalayan adventure that would challenge me physically and spiritually in ways I was only beginning to understand. But more than the immediate adventure, I was embarking on a larger journey of discovering what it meant to live with unlimited options and the responsibility that came with substantial wealth. I had resources that could fund dreams, solve problems, and create opportunities for people who'd never had the advantages I now possessed. The hiking group had told me I was too slow for their Saturday morning walks around Pine Ridge. They'd been wrong about my speed, wrong about my capabilities, and wrong about my worth. But in a strange way, they'd been right about one thing. I didn't belong in their group. I belonged somewhere much more interesting, somewhere that would challenge me to grow, contribute, and become the person Adelaide's legacy made possible. As my plane lifted off from Portland International Airport, I was finally walking at exactly the pace I was meant to walk, toward destinations and purposes I'd never dreamed were possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.